untapped human potential already within us that we haven't tapped.
And he told me about Joe and his work with alpha feedback, and so I built a little alpha feedback device, electronic, that made a tone whenever the person showed alpha.
A number of years ago where I predicted that EEG biofeedback would go nowhere. And boy, was I wrong on that one.
Trust in what your teachers are saying, but verify.
I'm Joe Kamiya from San Francisco, and I have been retired for some 15 years from the University of California in San Francisco. It's a school of medicine, and I was with the Department of Psychiatry. I am, however, a psychologist, and my entire career has been basically research with only secondary teaching responsibilities. So that's basically where I'm at. I am of Japanese American descent, which is probably worthwhile noting because there are not yet that many Asians in this field of biofeedback, and when one does show up, they're very visible, and so a lot of people recognize me, I think, by my earmarks of my ancestry.
Could you tell us a little bit about the birth of biofeedback?
Yes. Well, I got interested in biofeedback from way back in 1958 when I was teaching at the University of Chicago. And I was, generally speaking, interested in what is called self-perception. And I was particularly interested in the perception of one's own behavior. And there were certain kinds of research protocols that could be executed that would help train people to discern even such a simple thing as which foot was forward at the time that they were walking. And I would click a bell from time to time and have them guess, not without any instruction that I was focusing on their foot position, and just simply they didn't know. They had to walk up to a blackboard and make a check mark in the left column or the right column every time I dinged the bell in the course of their walk to the blackboard. And of course I randomized when they made the click. If their left foot was forward at the time I clicked a little my pen on the table, then making a check mark in the left column was called correct, and if they made a check mark in the right column, they were called wrong. Vice versa, if they were right foot happened to be forward at the time I made the click, they had to make a check mark in the right column. This kind of experimental procedure is generally speaking called discrimination training, where the target of the discrimination here is not some object in the external world, but rather a particular feature of the behavior stream of the individual. Well, these were interesting things to do, demonstration sorts of things, but they were not particularly revealing of anything other than the fact that this might become a useful procedure in a field in which I had recently moved in the laboratory of Nathaniel Kleitman and Bill Dement, who were then interested in dreaming sleep. And I got involved in a research project doing that. But in the course of doing that research, I'd be hooking up their EEG electrodes, and I noted that most subjects showed a fairly clear alternation of their alpha activity, waxing and waning, and when sometimes they were waxing for as long as, let's say, 2 to 5 seconds. Other times they would, the rhythm would wane, by which I mean, of course, the size of the rhythm as visible on the paper strip chart. And it occurred to me as I was recording these, of course the people were wide awake as I was preparing them, that, hey, I wonder if maybe using the same kind of discrimination training I used for left foot, right foot, maybe I could sound the bell from time to time when when the alpha rhythm was big, and had them guess whether it was big or small, actually, rather than having them try to guess sizes of anything, because they didn't know, they couldn't see their own trace. They were in one room and I was watching the polygraph strip chart on the other room. I said, I am able to record two fluctuations, two states of a brain wave. I won't tell you what they are, but let's see if we can have you learn to discriminate which of those two states you are. They alternate rather randomly. Sometimes I'll ring the bell when you're in something that we'll call state A. At other times I'll ring a bell in your room when you are in state B. And each time I do so, I would like you to make a guess whether you're in state A at the time of the bell or state B. And I'll inform you immediately whether your answer was correct or incorrect. So you can see the same discrimination procedures were used in this experiment. Except now we were looking at a much more subtle thing, which no one was sure would work. I'm fond of saying that my very first subject was, I'm fond of saying, was sent by God to encourage me on, because I have never had a subject who was quite so good as an experimental subject as this particular person. Briefly to recapitulate, I gave 60 trials each time within perhaps about 45 minutes. That is to say, I rang the bell 60 times, getting the person to guess each time what they were, and then immediately telling whether they were right or wrong. Well, the first day he got 50% right, which is exactly what he would have done had he flipped a coin. He had no connection he could discern no difference. The second day, however, he got about, as I recall, about 65% correct, which is not a whole lot to write home about, because it could have happened by chance. But on the third day, he got 85% correct. And so now things were getting interesting. And on the fourth day, after making one mistake, he ran not only 60 trials without error, but because he was doing so well, I just decided to run him on some more. I ran him for 400 trials. He was correct on every one. It's a very dramatic moment for me, because I didn't know, and he didn't know, that he could do this. Interesting. I asked him, how do you do this? Well, this person was not particularly given to introspective things. He was a junior chemistry major, but somehow he was apparently extremely able to detect whatever subtle differences there were in the state of mind associated with alpha large as opposed to alpha absent. And I asked him, how do you do it? And he said, well, I don't know. Sometimes it feels like I should say A, and other times I should say B, which is not a particularly articulate response, but it is what I was asking of him. Now, however, so that by itself was an interesting observation. It means that we can learn to discern certain sorts of things in our bodies, even though we cannot verbally describe what we are discerning. Now, but after running for a short while additional trials on subsequent sessions, and we went through a number of different modifications of procedure, he began to say, yes, I now realize that it's when I am looking at a visual image clearly in my mind, that's when I should say B, that's when there's alpha is absent. Vice versa, if I'm very non-occupied with thoughts when I'm relaxed and but awake, and I could be listening to music, but so long as I wasn't looking at something, the chances are very great that would be an A state if I rang the bell for that state at that moment. Well, that was interesting indeed, because now he was beginning to be able to verbally label a task that he could not do before. But even so, we were not completely convinced that we had the whole story, because after all, there were many other things that could have been happening as well. But for me, I was very encouraged that the experiment was successful and people could learn to do this. Well, on about the about sixth or seventh day, I've forgotten exactly which, we got tired of seeing this extremely accurate behavior going on, so I said to him, this time we're going to reverse the tables. Every time I ring the bell once, I would like you to try to get into the state you've been calling A, and hold it until I ring the bell twice. That is, ding, as opposed to ding, ding. He said, okay, and straight away I discovered give a single ding and he would give a continuous burst of alpha activity, page after page on the EEG, and when I gave him two dings, then he would stop within a couple of seconds and go into a complete absence of alpha. This man, young man, junior chemistry major from the University of Chicago, had apparently learned to control the rhythm, even though that was not my intent, by virtue of simply learning to discern the states at the time I gave him the discrimination training. Well, now, this latter part of control became the object of interest, both for me as well as the field in general, because I took one additional step. I said, well, maybe I can forego the training of discrimination, and suppose I provided a tone that went on whenever alpha was large enough over a criterion that I arbitrarily chose, and would go off when the alpha size dropped down to below that level. So he would hear, for example, a tone that might go like boo, 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 boo. And he was told to try to keep the tone on as much as possible. Well, he immediately learned how to do that. The first subject, of course, I had already trained, but the second subject, who had never been trained, never in discrimination training, was totally naive about the whole situation, did learn after a number of training sessions. Initially, when they tried to do this, they would succeed only in suppressing the size of the alpha, and that would sometimes last for as long as 2 or 3 sessions. But as was reported by several people now, one of the secrets of success in alpha is not to try so hard, and essentially to give up and relax, and that's when the alpha rises. So it's a kind of state in which the individual needs to learn to let it happen, if you will. It's a kind of a passive volition, as some have called it, so that it's a state in which it's relatively calm without a lot of intense thinking or intentional acts of one sort or another in the head, and where just almost listening for the tone in a passive way and just letting it happen was among the more successful ways to bring it about. Now, this business of training control with a feedback signal for control of the rhythm became the dominant preoccupation of the entire field of biofeedback, and has immediately been seen as potentially useful, if not with this particular wave, with other patterns. in a more health service-oriented kind of way. One of the first applications of this was by Barry Sturman. He had heard me give a talk about what I did with alpha, and he happened to be doing some experiments having to do with seizures, and he thought maybe he could train animals. He was working with cats, and they were seizure prone, and partially so because he was administering something that would induce seizures. And he found that indeed, first off, of course, he knew the signature of a seizure or a seizure about to occur, which is a distinct pattern in the EEG. And so he trained the animal to produce rhythms that were completely inimical to that particular pattern characteristic of seizures. It was called the sensory motor rhythm, which occurs at about 14 hertz at more or less at the top of the head, which is the sensory motor strip. And he found, lo and behold, when he did, he made the animals more resistant to seizures. So he immediately thought this could apply perhaps to human epileptic patients. And he ran a number of subjects and was successful in showing that, yes, biofeedback training can be effective in bringing about the prevention of seizures. Now, as you can imagine, this kind of idea seemed rather preposterous to many in the medical tradition. Well, after all, you can't really control seizures by some kind of a behavioral technique like this. But, I mean, the evidence has stayed up and continues. Unfortunately, it has not yet, as far as I know, become mainstream technology for the treatment of seizures because, for one thing, it may require more sessions than might be economically feasible for either the client or the hospital doing it, and perhaps could be more easily controlled by drugs. But I think that was a very important application of the biofeedback method, and others began picking up the basic idea and expanded beyond just the EEG. They went on to other things. Let me pause here because that sort of is the beginning parts. And started in 1958 when I first did my studies. I reported them not very much until about 1963 or 4 in various informal meetings or at meetings of the American Psychological Association where Barry heard my talk. And so in 1968, by that time, several other people had joined the fray, and we had a wonderful first annual conference in Santa Monica. We named ourselves the Biofeedback Research Society. And that later, through a couple of name changes, became what is now called the Association for Applied Psychophysiology and Biofeedback. So that was a story of how we got started in this field. It is impressive to me that now technology has caught up a lot with the field. The initial instruments were rather crude, handmade sorts of things as I had to deal with, and without a lot of electronic knowledge. I have to say I'm not an engineer, but I was able to improvise some of these things with the help of some technicians who could build me filters and electronic controllers for tones and so on. Now, I think that this field has a huge potential in the future. It has, since those years, it has not grown as rapidly as we had hoped it would. There is, of course, still a rather substantial population and pharmaceutical industry and medical skepticism about really is this stuff efficacious. part of the complexity of the resistance, I believe, emerged from the fact that some people were too quick to rush into wild claims for the efficacy of biofeedback for getting into some very, say, highly desirable states of mind. I was told that at one point on the Santa Cruz campus I was considered something of the next guru because I could perhaps maybe show the world how they could get on a high of the marijuana sort, or maybe even the LSD sort, even without the drugs, by simply training people to produce the brain waves associated with those states, with those drugs. Well, and others thought, well, you know, this was interesting for the practice of meditation. I want to comment, by the way, there was an interesting fact about that first meeting I referred to in Santa Monica in 1958, or perhaps it was 59.
Monica, 69.
I'm sorry?
1969 for Santa Monica.
In that very first one. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Yes, yeah, thank you. Yes, of course it was 69. Yeah, all right. 58 was when I did my first experiments in Chicago, yes. At that meeting, there were scientists of various persuasions, physicists, for example, some engineers, some medical people, and of course, a goodly number of psychologists. And also, there were some people with long hair, white robes, and bare feet. And I am now thinking about that what was obviously drawing people, it wasn't just the heads, the people who wanted to get high on this stuff. It was people who were fascinated by the fact that here is a tool that seems to permit people to become aware of things that are happening in their brain that they are not now clearly aware of. And that is, I think, a tremendously interesting thing to the public, to all persons. And I'm very much reminded when I used to do sleep and dream research with EEG and the like, I discovered that I could not give a bad talk. People, just so long as I was talking about dreaming sleep and the use of the EEG to detect them, people sat very attentively. It was as though I had them eating out of my hand. Everybody was really interested. Now, all of us, I think it's a perfectly natural response of curiosity. My gosh, maybe we can do other things, kind of, you know what I mean, with a brain wave, or with, by this time, of course, the skin conductance level, heart rate, and muscle tension feedback had developed. So, I am perhaps one of the few old diehards who believes that the future of biofeedback really should, of course, develop further along clinical lines, and it's a hard battle because, as I mentioned, there's some resistance to it, organized resistance, I might add. But that we mustn't forget, too, that there is that component of alpha feedback, or any kind of a feedback training, which doesn't draw attention just to the possibilities of control that people can learn from it, but in doing so, they must learn some of the internal cues that are relative to what they have to do to produce these rhythms. And it's that those internal cues, which I believe were working in my favor when I did my first discrimination trials, where I was not intent in training control. And that is my feeling now, that there are ways to improve upon the sort of training of individuals to discern a variety of different characteristics, not only of brainwave, but of body. And I've had some students work on this with the skin conductance level, for example, and we've tried this with other things like the theta rhythm and so on. But the long-range thing that I see about this field is that there is a close cousin called the meditation tradition, which represents more of that interest in the internal cues part than it does in the control part. Now, it's true that in much of the yogic tradition, one looks upon the enormous feats of body that they can achieve. But consider many other traditions, particularly, let's say, the Buddhist traditions, where the emphasis is on observing what's happening inside, where the emphasis is being calm and quiet, letting whatever natural events occur and just paying attention to them, but without trying to force them or to prevent them or whatever. The kind of an observational mode. It's that kind of observational mode which I believe is partially involved in what people have to have in order to learn feedback control, or both feedback control as well as to learn to discern or discriminate the variations in the EEG. There are many problems in the future, but I think it would be helpful to get together, as Richie Davidson has recently begun doing at Wisconsin, of getting really experienced meditators, like Tibetan meditators who have been doing it for 20 years or more, or something of that sort, bring them to his laboratory, and he has very powerful imaging technology, and not just simply the EEG, the functional magnetic resonance imaging process, whereby you can begin to get a little clearer picture of what's happening, not just at the cortex, but in deeper levels. He is reporting already that there are very significant differences in the brainwave patterns, the functional magnetic resonance imaging patterns, and possibly also the EEG, of meditators as opposed to people who are just simple novices or trainees and so on. It's not that I hold any particular position with respect to the value or the merits of meditation, but if you consider the fact that that is a tradition, it has been going on for some thousands of years, not just in the East, but also in various forms in the West, when you can think about prayer and silent meditation and so on, and that a certain body of teachings has developed, but in the form of the meditation trainer, such as being calm, not getting, and learning to deploy the attention in specific sorts of ways, and that certain things follow from that. And apparently something has been being transmitted generation after generation that forms the tradition, and has otherwise, if it was really not working, I think people would tire and stop and go do something else. They're apparently seeing some benefit from meditating. I am not myself a meditator, so I cannot say what those are, but I can easily imagine, as many people who have meditated have said, that there are some distinct benefits from it. But it's not just meditation, which still to most of us sounds a bit esoteric kind of activity, not the sort of thing we're going to do every day. So, but even though there is a growing interest by educated American people about the benefits of meditation and the science underlying the physiology thereof, which is what, of course, biofeedback would help contribute. It isn't just that. It's also in the whole domain of ordinary education. Just think of the fact that we grow up learning about physiology from, even in some better grade schools, about things like the heart and the muscles and how they function. And I know that we could also then provide with that kind of objective information what the person can experience when he has elevated muscle tension or elevated blood pressure or heart rate or skin conductance level or whatever. That's a form of personal education that's, in a sense, if you're in the broad sense, it's a physical education. And I believe we'd all be better off for knowing more about how our various states of mind are related to states of body and brain. We may not be able to put our fingers directly on specific benefits, except, of course, as in the clinical case, we already know we can help children overcome attention deficit disorder by training. But I'm referring to the general public, people who are not suffering from various disorders, but can simply be educated broadly. Now, there's, I believe, a strong case can be built that what we're talking about peculiarly is a personal science, in the sense that one observes what's happening and can report, as a matter of fact, what's happening to the external world, to other children, if their children are subjects, and they can agree or disagree with the observations. Well, it so happens that we have evolved as a species, and our central nervous structures are much the same across different population groups, and so it's not totally surprising that a particular physiologic configuration is associated with a parallel, not a parallel, but associated with a specific clump of experience components of mental processes, emotions or feelings or whatever. I think that would be a good shot, and I think then we would actually can be proud of the fact that we've actually added to the general curriculum of primary education, to say nothing of what we can do at the adult level, of which the panel that we just concluded on interpersonal biofeedback is now beginning to be recognized as terribly important. Only one last commentary about that, and that is that people are finally beginning to realize that the human species is a highly social species and is highly dependent upon interactions with others, members of the species, in interpersonal communications, in terms of bonding or rejection by one's peers or parents. We suffer enormously if some of those social factors do not go correctly from childbirth onward, and many developmental psychologists documented that. So what I'm saying is that we are taking a step forward when we put two people in the room, record them simultaneously, and observe the interaction process, and then perhaps train them in order to learn how to control their physiology during the process of interaction. That's a more representative circumstance for the individual than being in some isolation chamber, for example, in a clinic or laboratory. And I think that we will reap some new and very informative data. We will soon, I believe, come to have a much better, more adequate psychophysiology of the human being because of that. Because, as I say, we are part of each other in a very important way.
I've been way over here with you. I just started to ask one more question: do you have any advice for the future biofeedbackers that are just getting into the field now?
For the future biofeedback research, yes, I think that, I guess we need to get more people involved in supporting this nascent field. We tend to be operating too much in very small budgets and in small sample sizes. Clinical research should be grown much more so that we get more actual defendability of some of our claims. It's already fairly convincing, but how often do we constantly hear that, well, they don't really have a randomized controlled study with 1,000 patients? Okay, that's the kind of criticism we're constantly getting. Well, we don't have the budgets right now to do that. So this is one of the things I think we should go for. Let's face it, it's a marketing problem in a very important respect. Secondly, though, perhaps more fundamentally, I believe we need to learn from the social process how best to champion and further our own field of development. We need to learn to work together, to generate ideas together, like attending conferences, but not necessarily just having panels where person gets up and talks, but where there's a real group interchange that happens. And one of the things that's going to make that possible, I believe, is the internet. I believe we need to learn to put our heads together to learn not only various strategies of public facing the public, but also generating ideas. You know, there's a number of interesting fields that can be done. For example, can we learn, all of us, to become more efficient learners of languages? If we learn to put our mindsets in the right way, can we become better at dealing with each other? Can we learn to perhaps even learn some very abstruse subject matters? And it'll be a little bit going beyond what's currently known, but I happen to believe that we have evolved to the point where we have latent knowledge that can be brought forth in a maturation as a result of external stimulation from teachers, books, parents, etc. I look upon learning of things about nature, including oneself, as much maturation triggered by appropriate environmental circumstances as it is just simply by association learning, as we learn in the textbooks in psychology. It's a controversial position, but I think it's well worth exploring because there's a vast human potential already within us that we haven't tapped.